Welcome to Guitar Theory Academy. My name is Nathan Ayer, and in today's lesson we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of music theory. We're going to be starting with the basic building blocks, half and whole steps. Now this is the distance between two notes. If you don't understand this, all of your theory falls apart. You have to understand this. And the problem with guitar players, we get lazy and we end up playing songs our entire life and we never really understand half and whole steps or how it applies to the guitar. And then you wonder why you kind of get stuck 2 years later, right? This is why, because you've never learned some of this basic fundamental stuff. Everything falls apart if you don't understand this. So we're going to start on the piano. You don't have to understand piano, okay, but visually you're going to see the beauty of it, and then we're going to transfer it to the guitar. And you'll see why here in a sec, so just stay with me. So on the piano, if you're not familiar with the piano, it goes from left to right if you're starting from low to high, and you have to hit every single note if you want to go chromatically. So that's like hitting every single note on your fret, on a string, okay? But you have to hit the black. It goes from white to black, or black to white. Okay, so let's look at our first building block. It's called a whole step. And this is the distance between these two notes. And if we analyze it, you'll notice there is a note in between, or a hole in between. And that hole, it happens to be a note, right? Whole step. Okay, so on the piano, you can go from a black note to a black note, right? And there's a hole in between, right? There's a white note in between them. Okay, it's still a whole step apart. You can also go from a black note to a white note. There's the hole in between. And from a white note to a black note, and you'll see the hole in between. Those are all whole steps, okay? Second fundamental of music theory is a half step, right? You'll notice there's a half step, and there's 0 notes in between. Okay, at least in Western music, you can't cram any more notes in between these two notes, right? There's no black note in between there. So same thing with a black note to a white note, right? They're right next to each other, and from a white note to a black note. Okay, so now if you'll notice, a whole step is comprised of 2 half steps. Right? If you analyze a whole step, okay, there's a half step plus a half step equals a whole step. Right? So 2 halves equal a whole, right? Pretty simple stuff. Okay, so let's use this music theory. Let's apply this. And if I said, what's the distance between these 2 notes using the language of half and whole steps? Let's analyze. There's a whole step plus a half step. So your answer would be a step and a half. These 2 notes are a step and a half apart, or they're 3 half steps apart. All right? Because two half steps equal a whole plus another half, so 2 plus 1 is 3, right? Pretty simple. Okay, let's look at this next example. So analyze it. There's a whole step plus a whole step. All right? So these 2 notes are 2 whole steps apart. Or they're 4 half steps, right? 4 halves equals 2 wholes, right? Doesn't really matter. So on your test question, either one would work. Okay, so that's the language of half and whole steps on the piano. Let's transfer this to the guitar now, and you'll see why we visually did this on the piano here in a sec. Okay, I'm going to label the strings, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So this is like you're looking at your guitar from above. It's sitting on your lap. And that's kind of what you do anyway when you're holding your guitar in the normal position and you're leaning over looking at your fretboard hand, right? It's kind of like you're looking from above, right? That's the view. Okay, so let's pick a note on the 6th string, 4th fret. And if I said play me a hold note above on the same string, you play the 6th fret. Right? Notice there's a hole in between. There's a note in between these 2. This is a whole step apart. Okay. You can do this on the guitar, it's easy, right? You just, on any string it works, right? On the banjo, on the mandolin, the ukulele, on the violin, it doesn't really matter. As long as you're on the same string, right? Visually, that's what it looks like. Now the distance might be a little bit different, obviously, physically, if it's a mandolin or violin, right? But visually it looks the same. Okay, let's look at a half step. Now notice these 2 notes are right next to each other, frets 1 and 2. Right? You can't cram any notes in between. Frets 2 and 3, on the 1st string, 9 and 10. Right, that's a half step. Okay, now I'm going to label these 2 and give them their names, C and D. These 2 notes on the guitar on the 8th and 10th fret are a whole step apart. So the interesting thing happens on the guitar. If we want to play these 2 notes at the exact same time, On this string, we can't. Right? On the piano, you just hit the two notes. So we have to take this D, if we want to play it at the same time, we have to move it to a different string. So we're going to move it to the 5th string, 5th fret. Okay, but these two notes, even though visually they look differently, they're still a whole step apart. They sound exactly the same. It's just like having two pianos, and if you closed your eyes and I played a C on one and it reached over and played a D on another one, you wouldn't tell the difference. You couldn't tell if I was playing it on the same piano or two different pianos, right? It's exactly the same. It's just visually it would look differently. That's all that's happening here. Okay, so let's do another little experiment. Let's pretend these two strings are tuned exactly the same. Okay, now in standard tuning, they're not. On a regular guitar standard tuning, these two strings are not tuned the same. But let's say a 12-string guitar, if these two had the same exact strings, or how about a mandolin, right? There are instruments that have two strings together, right? And they just beef up the sound. In this case, it would be easy to play these together, right? But unfortunately, in standard tuning, that 5th string is tuned differently than the 6th string, okay? And that happens to be tuned to an A. And it's this A on the 5th string. Okay, so if these two strings were the same, in order to tune this to standard tuning, we have to tune this and we have to wind the string around the tuning peg, in which it stretches the string, right? Just like a rubber band, you pull it and it moves not only the A, but it moves the C and the D as well. Therefore, this is why we get visually these two notes, right? Because we had to tune that to standard tuning. Now, if it's not tuned in standard tuning, you're hosed, right? It's different, okay? And we'll get into that later, but for right now, we're working with standard tuning. Okay, so let's look at our two new options now. Remember, these are like two different pianos, and if I said play the C followed by a D, we can now have options, which is way different than the piano, right? We can play the C and the D, or how about the 3rd and 10th fret on different strings, or how about the 3rd and 5th on the same string, right? Okay, we got options now, and that's what's cool about the guitar. We can do things that the piano players can't. The problem is if we want to play at the same time, we're limited. And you're probably limited to this option, at least on these two strings, right? That's kind of the visual. It's one string up and 3 frets back, right? From the C to the D. I don't think you can reach the other two, right? So this is the most comfortable. This is the visual pattern for the whole step on two different strings. Okay, now let's look at the piano. There's our, pretend like the two strings, right? And all we did is someone pushed the piano to the left, we rolled it to the left, and we played C and D, right? That's how we get our pattern. Exact same notes, two different pianos. It's still a whole step apart. Okay, they sound the same. Okay, so now, the only problem, this pattern, okay, if you play the guitar for a while, you'll realize that darn old 2nd string throws things off, okay? I'm going to explain that here in a sec. So our pattern is if these two notes are a whole step apart, okay, this pattern works the same on the 5th and 4th strings, right? 1 fret up, 3 frets back. It works on the 4th and 3rd strings visually. But something happens, here's our normal pattern, but something happens on that 2nd string. It's tuned differently, and we're going to get into that later, but all you have to know is that anytime a note lands in any pattern, it lands on the 2nd string, and you're going from the 3rd string, right? It moves up 1/2 step. And we're going to explain why later. It's just tuned differently, right? We didn't stretch it as much, right? Therefore, it didn't pull as much around the tuning peg. That's the only reason why, right? But the good news is it lands back in the same pattern, okay? So all you have to know is our pattern looks like this, except for when it lands on the 2nd and 3rd string. Okay, let's look at a 1/2 step. Again, if we want to play the C and B at the same time, we have to move the C to a different string. Now, a 1/2 step looks like this, right? It's 1 string up and 4 frets back. Okay, that's a 1/2 step. Again, let's look at our little experiment. Here's a mandolin or a 12-string guitar. Okay. But of course we want to tune to open, that open A, standard tuning. So again, we wind the string, it brings everything over, and again, this is how we get our pattern visually. And again, here's our two notes, B and C. We got options to play B and C now, one right after the other. That one's a stretch, we can still do it. You can see. But of course, if we want to play them at the same time, we're kind of limited to this one, right? Okay, so that's our pattern. 1 string up and 4 frets back towards the nut. That's the visual pattern. And that's the half step. Okay, let's visually look at this pattern. Again, on different sets of strings. All right, looks exactly the same, except, okay, here's our problem one. One of the notes landed on the second string, therefore, it looks like that now. And that's where it gets confusing, because normally that looks like the whole step pattern, right? But now it's not. All right, this is a half step. That's what makes the guitar a little bit confusing. But then we redeem ourselves by going back to our same pattern on the second and first string. Okay, that is the half step. So there you go. That is the half and whole steps on the guitar. Watch this a couple times if you need to. Really understand this. Get that concept, especially of that second string, moving that up a half step. You really need to know that. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. And thanks for watching.